As part of Fall to Ireland's suite of supports and resources for HR in relation to reopening, this short video will give you an understanding of meeting the national return to work protocols in relation to your requirements in that regard. Today we're going to go through the protocols in detail and what each of these means for you and your business. There's a number of protocols in that government guidelines, and Fall to Ireland have put those into a document that's user friendly for you to facilitate you to implement these in your business. So let's go through each of them now. The first area of requirement is to put in place a business response plan. In advance of returning to work, employers will develop an up-to-date business response plan in relation to COVID-19. Included in the plan is what will you do if there's suspected cases and also measures to control any identified risks that may occur. The next key area to look at is induction training. It is an obligation that employers must provide an induction training for all workers. This training should at minimum include the latest up-to-date advice and guidance in relation to public health. Things like including what a worker should do if they develop symptoms of COVID-19, details of how the workplace is organised to address the risk, an outline of the response plan, points in relation to forms of contact with employers and workers, and any other specific advice that is relevant to your specific business should be included in your induction training. It's important to ensure that all staff receive this training as soon as possible, and also that you ensure the training is documented and recorded to ensure that if the Health and Safety Authority were to do an inspection, you can show them how you've met all your obligations, including this one, in line with the protocol. You can refer to the Health and Safety Authority website regarding templates and checklists. There's really good guidelines available from this website in relation to ensuring you've covered all the necessary steps in relation to the induction training. The link is here to assist you in this regard. The next requirement is to develop a contact log. To ensure the prompt identification and isolation of potentially infectious individuals, it is really important to protect those at work by putting in place a contact log. Employers will keep the log of contact and work groups to facilitate quick and easy contact tracing if that was required. It's also important to ensure you inform workers and others of the purpose of the log. So, for example, if you had a contractor visiting the business, they too would be required to record their details in this log. It's important that the log should only be used for the purpose it is designed in relation to COVID-19 contact tracing, because people are sharing from a GDPR perspective information with you, so it should be used for no other purpose other than that. The next requirement is information display for employees. So it's important to display information on signs in relation to the symptoms of COVID-19, in relation to the importance of how to correctly hand wash, and also to display advice in relation to ensuring that customers are also adhering to what is required in relation to managing and proactively reducing the risk associated with COVID-19. The next obligation is to do a risk assessment and identify practical steps in relation to eliminating and reducing risk associated with COVID-19. The approach to the risk assessment is to first of all do an employee flow, so that you would look at all elements of the journey an employee has within the business from when they start work to when they finish, and any identifiable risks of the spread of COVID-19 should be identified and measures to reduce or eliminate that risk should be put in place. So, for example, internal doors where a lot of people are touching would be a risk. So, to reduce that risk, you may put door stoppers in place so that the doors are actually open. It's also important that you do the same risk assessment in relation to the customer flow. So you look at all potential touch points and all potential risks in relation to that customer flow and customer journey. And again, reduce or eliminate those risks. So, for example, in relation to check in at reception, how do we proactively reduce the risk in terms of physical distancing, etc., to still facilitate that job to be done? Remember, the requirement in relation to risk assessment is to do all that is reasonably practicable. And this requires you to consider all appropriate, reasonable measures that you can put in place. Fáilte Ireland have lots of examples of preventative measures on their website, and that would be a very good starting point to help you do your personalised risk assessment to suit your premises, because all businesses will be slightly different in that regard. The next area we're going to look at is the importance of drafting the appropriate policies. So, the key policies that are relevant include some of the following. First of all, it's important you put in place a coronavirus policy or a COVID-19 policy. This will ensure the employee is very clear in relation to what you as an employer are doing, but also in relation to their obligations to reduce the risk and spread of COVID-19, and also the duty of care they have to their fellow colleagues in relation to ensuring that they're doing all practical guidance following to ensure that they're not putting themselves or their colleagues at risk. The coronavirus policy should be updated, even if you have drafted it at the early stages of COVID-19, to now incorporate all the return to work measures that you've put in place. It's important, like all policies, that the coronavirus policy would be signed off by staff to ensure they read, understand, and accept the policy. This can be done in conjunction with your staff handbook, because all your staff will have a contract of employment and a staff handbook in line with the terms of employment information legislation, which is a legal obligation. Other policies that you may need to review and possibly amend are your sick policy, in light of now identifying coronavirus as an identifiable disease that employees need to proactively inform you about. It's also important to consider absence notification and management as part of this policy. Other policies that may be relevant include remote working, if it is applicable, annual leave in terms of ensuring people are still proactively booking and taking holidays during this period of time, flexible work arrangements, and what you are willing to consider, and the application process if people would like to be considered for flexible working at this time. And finally, layoff and redundancy, if that is something that you may need to revisit. You will likely to have these policies already in your staff handbook, so it's now worth doing a review and amend them accordingly. Any changes you make to any of your policies, particularly your coronavirus policy, which will require updates since the initial stages of the pandemic, it's important, as I said, to ensure that they're signed off by your employees to ensure that they see the importance of these policies. So, the next area we want to look at is the return to work form. The return to work form has been identified as good practice and a requirement to ensure that we involve the employee in terms of communicating with us proactively in relation to any potential contact or symptoms they may have. The guidelines is that it should be completed at minimum 3 days in advance of the employee's return. But that can be done earlier to facilitate planning, etc., if required. However, you should notify the employee that they should remind you or update the form if they have had any contact with anybody from when they filled in the form and when they return to work. I would also advise that any staff member who has been on annual leave for more than 5 days or out of the business for more than 5 days would also complete the form when they return again. This is a guideline and you can decide to do it more frequently should you so wish. Remember also, fundamentally ingrained in your absence policy, your sick policy, and your coronavirus policy will be the importance of highlighting at any stage if any employee has had contact that they notify you immediately. So it's not just through this return to work process. So the form should seek confirmation from the employee to the best of their knowledge that they have no symptoms of COVID-19 and also confirm they're not self-isolating or awaiting results from a COVID-19 test. It's important to include the following questions on your form. Do you have symptoms of cough, fever, high temperature, sore throat, runny nose, breathlessness, or flu like symptoms now or in the past 14 days? Have you been diagnosed with confirmed or suspected COVID-19 infection in the last 14 days? Are you a close contact of a person who is a confirmed or suspected case of COVID-19 in the past 14 days? And have you been advised by a doctor to self isolate at this time? And finally, have you been advised by a doctor to cocoon at this time? They're the questions that should be involved in your form, and we also have a template of that form available here. It's also important at this time that if you have an employee assistance program, you should make employees aware of any potential supports that you have in place, including your employee assistance program or occupational health service. Fáilte Ireland have an employee assistance program available, and here is a link to that program. The next measure to put in place is a worker representative. So, the idea of the worker representative is to ensure that we involve workers collaboratively in terms of doing the risk assessment and proactively addressing concerns that employees may have within the business. Each workplace will appoint at least one lead worker representative charged with ensuring COVID-19 measures are strictly adhered to in their place of work. If you already have employee representatives in place, in relation to a health and safety committee or a worker committee already, they can form this role. They can be one and the same. It's important that the person or persons undertaking the role must receive necessary training and have a structured framework to follow within the organisation to be effective in preventing the spread of the virus. Employers will have regular and meaningful engagement with their worker representative or relevant body. Remember, if depending on the number of staff you have, it might make more sense to have a number of people so that it's fully representative of the workforce. Also, it's important that breaks are something that you need to consider at this time. So it should mean that breaks are staggered to facilitate maintenance of physical distancing at break times. It's also important to consider implementing additional tea and coffee stations within the business for our staff to again avoid the potential congregation of people at the one time. It might also be important to consider the clock machine and other areas where people potentially congregate at the moment as part of your risk assessment. Finally, the importance of PPE or personal protective equipment. The use of PPE may already be required in many of your workplaces already. For example, in relation to chemicals, in relation to hard shoes, etc. In this context, the employers should consider what is necessary in relation to guidelines in your workplace. Once you have confirmed specific PPE must be worn, it is important that employees are trained in the proper use, cleaning, storage, and disposal of PPE. It is also important that if employees are restricted to wear the PPE, that it is important that management would consistently and properly ensure it is worn and used correctly. And it should be inspected to ensure that this is enforced consistently also. The FAQ, template and checklist to support this video are located here on the Fáilte Ireland website. Thank you for listening to this video and I hope you found it useful.